Asia is not an Asian word. Asians traditionally did not call themselves Asians. The Malays talked about people above the winds and people below the winds because of the importance of the monsoon. The Chinese had concentric circles, inner and outer barbarians and so forth. Asia, actually, those of you who read St. Paul may know this. When St. Paul talked about going to Asia, what did he mean? Right, Turkey, exactly. He meant Turkey, Anatolia. And the speculation is that the word Asia comes from an ancient kingdom in Anatolia. So I show in one of my chapters that as the knowledge of geography grew, and as Western cartographers began to map areas going further east, the notion of Asia rolled steadily eastward. At one point they talked about farther India, and you still talk about Indochina, Indonesia, and so on because of India's cultural influence. But I argue that actually our image of Asia has rolled too far east. We think of it as China and Japan, and I sort of tug it back to include India and southward to include Australia. The Navy has quite an interesting concept of littoral Asia, as in shoreline Asia, and they talk about the leeward and seaward edges of littoral Asia, which extends into the Bay of Bengal. And that's very similar to my concept as well. But there is this rich historical legacy of maritime Asia. It used to be part of what was then a global system. A Portuguese commentator defending Portugal's conquest of Malacca on the Strait of Malacca back in 1511 said, "Whoever is lord of Malacca has his hand on the throat of Venice." And there was, in fact, one seamless trading route that included Eastern Africa. Unfortunately, the western wing of this great trading system has withered. The Middle East is in conflict and insufficiently globalized and so forth, but the eastern wing of this has, in fact, revived. But as I said, governments are really not focusing on this. Many of them are still struggling to consolidate their own legitimacy and their own power in areas that are not necessarily natural units. And so what they're doing, I argue, has as much to do, this is finding number 2, it has as much to do with politics and security as it does with economics. So what are they doing? What is this new regionalism? And I'll be very brief about this because your eyes will glaze over if I talk about all of the organizations. Essentially there was in formal terms anyway, it is expressed in a statement of the so-called East Asian Vision Group, which was put out in 2001 by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, 10 nations plus China, Japan, Korea. And it envisaged 3 communities: an economic community, a security community, and a socio-cultural community. Toward this end, a number of organizations have been formed, and the Asian Development Bank has actually joined this effort to help the Asians create more of a community. The simplest way to describe these organizations is to think of the 5 founding members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, who, in the name of anti-communism, back in 1967, formed ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and these are Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand. Those are the ASEAN 5, and they are the drivers of this whole movement that I've described. And it's a paradox because they are weak countries. This is sort of the politics of weakness. They are much weaker than the regional powers such as Korea, China, Japan, India, but they are in fact the drivers of this, and I'll explain their motives in a moment. And beyond this ASEAN 5, there's ASEAN as a whole, which includes Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Burma, Vietnam, and Brunei. But they're not major players in this movement. And then beyond ASEAN, there's this ASEAN plus 3. This is China, Japan, and South Korea. And finally, there's something called the East Asia Summit Group, which includes India, Australia, and New Zealand, as well as the 13 countries. So sometimes if I'm talking to students and I want to see if they're paying attention, I say, quick, how many countries is ASEAN plus 3 plus 2 plus 1? 16. All right. So there are potentially 16 countries involved in this regional integration movement. And you might say, well, what's the relationship between these concentric circles? Well, it's very vague, it's overlapping, it's duplicative, lots of photo ops, lots of meanings, and I argue in the book that is designed deliberately to be very fluid and open-ended. The most visible manifestation of this regionalism is a starburst of trade agreements and also financial agreements to some extent. Practically every bilateral combination you can think of within this 16-nation grouping has now some sort of trade agreement. They call it a free trade agreement. I call it a preferential trade agreement. Many of them are full of holes, lots of exceptions, long time before they're actually enforced. But they are. There's a big starburst of these things, and there are also bilateral currency swap agreements in place. There's also something called the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which all these countries have signed. We have not signed it. And it's essentially a statement of peaceful relations, non-interference, respect for each other's sovereignty, and so forth and so on. It's not really a treaty in a NATO sense. It's more a statement of principles, and all 16 of the countries have signed it. So that's sort of what regionalism looks like from the outside. All of this, as I said, excludes the United States. So it doesn't matter. And here I argue that the answer to whether or not it matters depends on what is going on there. And here's my finding 3, that Asia's new regionalism is an expression of the changing balance of influence, and it reflects high-stakes diplomacy. Now, some people, some Asian economists will say, well, this is really going an expression of closer economic relations of the sort that I referred to. But it's not really about trade, and let me explain briefly why. First of all, some of this economic integration began to take place before any of this regionalism began to develop. And what's really going on is the growth of China-centered production networks. That's the big change in the economic aspect of Asia in the last 10, 15 years. A gradual realignment of the division of labor such that Southeast Asians and Japan and Korea have tried to find a niche to produce something that is exported to China, and then China adds components and then it's re-exported. Most of us are wearing something probably that says made in China, but there's a lot of, that's a misleading label. Something like 50% plus of China's exports have imported components, 50 to 60% at least. And the same percentage, even higher, refers to Chinese exports produced by foreign companies investing in China or investing with a Chinese partner in China. So there's this made in China label is very misleading. I mention that because it's a big trade issue here, but from the Asian perspective, it's a big opportunity because their markets are in fact growing in China for the most part, and even the manufactured component of Asian exports to China have been growing. There isn't sort of free trade or anything like it, but there are new opportunities that the Chinese have offered their Asian partners. China's own dependence on Europe and North America is still very high. So the reason I say that trade is not responsible for an Asian-only integration movement is that the Asians as a whole, counting China, are very dependent on the global economy. In fact, you could describe this whole economic trend that I just described in terms of globalization. So if it's not really about trade, then why are all these trade agreements? And here I argue that, and this may be a reach, but I think trade agreements in the post-Cold War world are the geopolitical expression of peaceful relations among states, comparable to what security treaties used to be in this more flexible post-Cold War world. They're clearly a sign of peaceful intent among countries and friendship, and that's why you see all of them scrambling to negotiate these agreements with each other. Some of them, like those involving Singapore, are genuinely liberalizing. Singapore is very committed to free trade, but others are set aside so many sectors and protect them from free trade that you can hardly call them free trade agreements. But all of them signify a peaceful intent in the region. And this was not a peaceful region, if you remember, right after World War II, let alone in past periods of history. But ASEAN has had no conflict since 1967 among its members. And although the region still has some areas of tension, like Korea and Taiwan, actually it is a stable and peaceful region. So then what are these geopolitical motives, other than looking like a good citizen and being peaceful? And not to be too cute, I come up with the 4 R's.